That is because shamed individuals believe that the genuine self is bad. Shame is the only emotional state that is dysfunctional for the individual and functional for the group. This style of parenting makes the children believe that they are bad. In public and private debates, shaming the opposition is a common tactic used when people feel like they are losing the factual side of an argument. These shamed children will one day grow up and become active members of society. People who use shaming tactics are people who struggle themselves with shame. Online shaming has become a common tactic used in social media to implement mob justice. In fact, narcissists are trying to hide their crooked nature when they shame others. And when you find yourself being shamed, never defend yourself. Which explains why narcissists are so effective at using shaming language to maintain control over women in relationships. The most toxic shaming environment that exists today is of course the school and education system.
Shame!
Hello you wonderful people. It's LP back with a new video. Today we will be discussing toxic shame and how shaming language is used by malignant individuals and toxic organizations. First, let's define what shame is. Shame is a state of being where a person is self-conscious, feels powerless, worthless, and ultimately feels vulnerable and lives in constant fear of being exposed. To put it in simple terms, it's an individual's irrational feeling that they are, at their very core, a bad person. Shaming someone means to actively assign a state of shame to that person. This is done mainly in order to manipulate and control that person's behavior. When someone uses shaming language, it is all about making the person they target believe that he or she is a bad person because of something they did, something they said, or something they believe in. Shaming is purely an attempt at controlling the targeted person's thoughts and behaviors, all because the shamer does not like or approve of those. When used by malignant people, shaming language is applied intentionally to reduce someone's self-worth and to make that person more submissive and easier to subjugate and control. Shaming language makes the shamed person believe that there is something inherently wrong with them and that they actually are a bad person. As a result, this shame creates a sense of paranoia in this person, a sense that if they are not careful, they will be exposed for being a bad person. Shame also creates a cognitive dissonance between the genuine self and actions in the real world. That is because shamed individuals believe that the genuine self is bad, so they reject their natural impulses and desires, and instead, these individuals allow external factors and entities to determine and shape their actions. For example, authority figures like parents, teachers, and bosses, groupthink, intellectual ideas, media, sociocultural narratives, politics, etc. This state of confusion in shamed individuals makes them prime targets for exploitation, mainly to narcissists. That's because narcissists are always on the lookout for easy victims to control, victims that can carry out the narcissist's agenda and be submissive to them. Most people who use shaming language are narcissistic individuals, mainly vulnerable types. They shame others because they claim, some of them even believe, that they have the right to judge others because of their superior sense of morality and self-righteousness, which is totally not true, by the way. In fact, narcissists are trying to hide their crooked nature and corrupted moral fiber when they shame others. Shaming language is also an attempt by narcissists to divert the discussion away from facts and logical arguments and to elicit an emotional response from the person they're arguing with. Deep down, narcissists know they can't win an argument on pure logic because their logic is always flawed and because their intentions are malicious in the first place. For targets of shaming language, the long-term effect of being shamed constantly is that the victims will start to use shaming language against others, but also against themselves, which effectively means the eradication of the genuine self, the complete diminishment of self-worth, and the internalization of the shaming abuser. Shame and humiliation are very similar to one another, and usually go hand in hand, with humiliation being the decreasing of someone's social value in the eyes of others. The only difference between shame and humiliation is that humiliating someone requires an audience, while shaming someone can be done without an audience. However, when the shaming is done by a group of people, the result is both shame and humiliation, because the group in this case is also the audience. Shame is also confused with guilt. The difference between guilt and shame is that a person who feels guilt believes that their actions are bad, whereas someone who feels shame believes that they themselves are bad. This differentiation is relevant to our discussion when we look at the origin of shaming in cultures. To understand a culture, we must first look at parenting styles. This isn't set in stone, but it is believed that there are two styles of parenting: guilt-based parenting and shame-based parenting. Many cultures, especially Eastern and Southern cultures, use shaming as their main parenting style. This style of parenting makes the children believe that they are bad. These shamed children will one day grow up and become active members of society. So on a large scale, this risks creating a shamed society and culture that will be toxic and dysfunctional. This may be an explanation as to why many authoritarian regimes arise within these cultures. And as we will later see in examples, totalitarian regimes use shame and humiliation extensively in their effort to maintain control over their subject populations. Western cultures, on the other hand, traditionally tend to use more of a guilt approach to parenting, an approach which separates judging the behavior from the child. However, it seems that parenting trends within the West are also starting to shift to a more shame-based approach. This could be due in part to the migration of people from shame-based cultures into the West, influencing the culture in which they settle, but also due to the continuous rise of narcissism in Western culture as a whole. These among many other factors, of course. This can partially explain the current state of tension and socio-political divide most Western societies are experiencing. Shame exists as a social mechanism that regulates people's behavior so they match those of the group. Many social groups and cultures use shame as a way to shun their members when they act in a way that goes against the group culture. Shame is the only emotional state that is dysfunctional for the individual and functional for the group. Shame yields results in the short term, but in the long term, excessive shaming creates resentment and toxicity in the environment. Shaming can be dangerously effective when it is done in large groups. That is because of the humiliation that comes with it, but also because most of these shaming groups are led by toxic narcissistic individuals. These toxic and malignant individuals have an ability to tap into other people's feelings of shame, and through manipulative communication, they can mobilize these shamed individuals to form shaming groups. I call those shaming packs, like hyenas. Once these shaming packs are consolidated, they can be weaponized and used to shame whoever the narcissistic leadership sets their target on, with devastating consequences, I might add. If you have to retain one thing, it's this: shame is beneficial to the group, but detrimental to individual freedom. It becomes then a question of how much individual freedom one is willing to give away in order to belong and be part of a group. That, knowing full well that shame would likely be used against that individual when they behave in a way that is different from the norm within that group. I personally have zero tolerance for shame being used against me. Anyone using shame on me is excommunicated from being in my life. And if it means not being part of any group, so be it. I value personal freedom more than I value belonging. But hey, that's just me. You may have a different opinion on that. Anyway, let's look at some examples of shaming usage. On the macro level, public displays of shaming and humiliation have been used throughout history to dishonor and punish certain groups and individuals. Such examples include corporal punishments like public floggings and whippings, public head shavings, as they did in France to female Nazi collaborators, crucifixions in Roman times, the pillory in the Middle Ages, tarring and feathering in the early colonial period, forcing certain people to wear distinct symbols of shame, like the yellow badge for Jews in Nazi Germany, or the skull's bridle for women suspected of witchcraft. In communist China, struggle sessions were a form of political shaming and public humiliation used by the CCP to put pressure on and persecute individuals considered enemies of the regime. Although the brutal and inhumane practices of public shaming were mostly discontinued in the developed world, they seem to have recently seen a re-emergence with the prevalent use and consumption of television and social media. Today, one of the main sources of shaming we are being constantly bombarded with comes from corporate advertisements. Also, online shaming has become a common tactic used in social media to implement mob justice on people who allegedly misbehave or have opposing socio-political views. Online shaming consists mainly of call-outs of someone's behavior or speech, calls for cancellation, in other words, cancel culture. Also, negative reviews online, and finally, exposing aspects of someone's private life, like doxing or revenge porn. While some of them evil shits know the implications of what they are doing, most of the people partaking in online shaming are not even aware of the real-life damaging consequences their shaming campaign has on their targets. In general, mob justice always results in punishments far brutal in relation to what one is being accused of. Some examples of online shaming include body shaming, calling out someone's body flaws and imperfections, done mainly by women to other women. Slut shaming, which to me means wrongfully accusing someone of being a slut. You also got COVID shaming, as in shaming someone for not wearing their stupid mask or keeping the randomly picked 6 feet distance. We'll talk more about COVID in the next video. There are many other silly shaming trends online, all with the same purpose of creating divisions, hysteric outrage, and promoting victim mentalities. I personally try not to pay them any attention because of the reasons I just described. So let's move on, shall we? In public and private debates, shaming the opposition is a common tactic used when people feel like they are losing the factual side of an argument. Shaming here is used primarily to shut down the debate in one's favor. Many adherents of some political and cultural ideologies use this tactic to gain the upper hand in debates. The left in particular has been relentless these recent years in their strategy of shaming people into accepting their political agenda. Moving on, shaming is also common in the workplace, perpetrated by toxic bosses and co-workers. For example, being publicly called out in a meeting for a mistake you made or being called incompetent, useless, etc. Shaming in the workplace is toxic and problematic when it is done in front of others, because it adds a layer of humiliation to it. We can't expect bosses to be mental health experts. Work is a result-driven environment. Being called out and shamed for messing up is to be expected. But such call-outs have to be done in a diplomatic, private, and discreet manner, with feedback added to it. Shaming can be a way to push employees to achieve results, but these results are always suboptimal because of the negative, toxic energy of shame that's driving them. Many organized religions and cults also use shame on their followers. I'm not going to get too much detailed on this one, because it's a subject that deserves a video of its own. Some adults also believe that using shame on younger people is acceptable. The most toxic, shaming environment that exists today is of course the school and education system. Every one of us has been shamed by a teacher at least once during their school years. The student-teacher power dynamic is very unbalanced, and many educators are almost left unchecked in their power, so they are automatically inclined to abuse it. Toxic shaming at school is a nasty problem, and it requires a lot more attention and reform to fix it, so that schools can finally stop damaging young people's mental health and natural talents. Let's look now at shaming on the micro level. Overall, shaming as a tactic is used more by women than by men. However, with the growing number of effeminate beta males, simps, and trolls, so-called men have also started using shaming language. Interpersonal shaming can come in the form of disapproving passive-aggressive remarks, comments, or observations. This is the most common type of shaming and is very subtle. For example,
"You put on some weight. Did you brush your teeth this morning? You eat too fast. You're a terrible son."
It can also be overt, like name-calling. Ridicule, as in making fun of someone's mannerisms, appearance, etc. False exaggerated accusations, like calling someone a misogynist, racist, homophobe, bigot, Islamophobe, or infidel. Nagging is a mild form of shaming, used mainly by women in relationships, but also on complete strangers, the Karen phenomenon being a prime example of that. Some of the most common shaming phrases used on men include,
You probably don't get laid. You don't get any dates. You're not a real man. You're just butthurt. You're probably a loser. Man up. You're scared. You're so insecure. You're so weird. You're so childish. Grow up.
Of course, some of these can be used on both men and women. Shaming women revolves mainly around calling them some variant of unlovable, fat, ugly, or slut. Women are aware of shaming language when it is overt like that, but less so when it is done in more nuanced and subtle ways, which explains why narcissists are so effective at using shaming language to maintain control over women in relationships. Men are naturally more resilient to shaming language. Yes, it is effective at shaping their behavior, but it doesn't create too much damage psychologically, at least not on the short term. A woman being shamed, on the other hand, can be a devastating blow to her ego and self-esteem. To be clear, I am not encouraging you to use these tactics. I am only showcasing them to you so you can identify when they are being used against you. I take no responsibility whatsoever if you decide to use these petty tactics. Shame is toxic and contagious. People who use shaming tactics are people who struggle themselves with shame. Shame is one of the main causes for the development of narcissism in the personality structure, and is the main reason why narcissism is contagious. Check my video about narcissism to understand what I mean by this. When you are shaming someone, you are projecting your toxic shame on that person. That person internalizes it and starts doing the same thing to others. The key emotions in all forms of shame are resentment and contempt. When being shamed, the negative energy and the emotions that build up are directed first and foremost towards the self, and passive aggression becomes the primary attitude to dealing with other people. Shame makes a person believe that he or she is a fraud. Actions designed to uncover or expose someone can then be used to place more shame on a person like that. The shamed person's core belief of being bad, whether it's true or false, leaves them vulnerable to those malignant attacks and creates a paranoid fear of being exposed, which is also the main characteristics of imposter syndrome. So if a person suffers constantly from imposter syndrome, chances are that person has been shamed and continues to struggle with it. Another consequence of toxic shame is that it leads to sexual depravity and sadomasochistic tendencies. This stems from that same belief of being bad, and this sexual behavior defines many, if not all, narcissistic characters. Also, the humiliation that comes with being shamed can create a state of rage called humiliated fury, which internally causes apathy and depression among other things, and externally gives rise to paranoia, sadistic behavior, and fantasies of revenge. So these are some of the effects caused by shame. Hopefully, now you have some clarity and are able to identify when shaming tactics are being used against you, either by organizations or by the people around you. You may have also found out that you've been using shaming language in the way you communicate with the people around you. That's okay. You can now start making adjustments so that you are less toxic for the people around you. I'll finish off with some tips on how to deal with shaming language. You must first of all become unapologetic about what you like and stop denying your true wants and feelings. You have to understand who you are and radically accept yourself as you are. For all of this to work, you have to first develop boundaries and be assertive enough to enforce them. If you need help with this, then check out my video about boundaries, communication, and assertiveness. You can listen to it as a sleep aid. Also, you must stop being afraid of conflict and rejection, and stop trying to gain the approval of the people shaming you, even if it's your own parents doing that. You cannot ever be afraid of shaming language. And when you find yourself being shamed, never defend yourself. You'd have played right into the shamer's hands if you do that. Instead, you can do two things. 1. Eliminate the toxic shaming people from your life. Block them, unfriend them, break up with them, move out, relocate to another city if you have to. Just keep them away from you. 2. If you can't get rid of them, then use shaming language back on them. Call them out and shame them for using shaming language. I'll give you a situation that happened to me as an example. I found myself in a position where I had to politely reject a young woman's advances. Her response to the rejection was that I must be gay.
Oh, you must be gay.
Shaming language. I identified it. I did not try to defend or explain myself. I simply countered. Is there something wrong with gay people? Are you homophobic? And instantly, I could see her getting flustered and trying to explain herself, scrambling for a response. That, my friends, is how you put a shaming person on the back pedal. And with that, I give you my final tip. Never, ever tolerate shaming language from anyone. Period.
Shame on you for not liking this video. Shame on you for not sharing it. And shame on you for not subscribing. You racist, xenophobe, homophobe, bigot, commies.
Nah, I'm just kidding. You guys are great. I've been receiving a lot of thank you messages, and it makes me happy to know that people find my videos to be helpful. If you too found this video to be full of value, and you enjoyed the non-BS, straight to the point, psychological content and information that I provide, then consider becoming a patron over on Patreon to support this work. I mean, I'm saving you years of therapy and heartbreak with this information. And, if nothing else, it's good karma. So link will be in the description if you're interested. Anyway, thank you wonderful people for watching, and see you on the next one. Take care. Bye bye.